Hello, my name is Bilal Al-Kafaf. I'm a consultant surgeon at Salford Royal Foundation Trust in Manchester. I'd like to start by thanking August for the invitation to present a summary of our work today. This was an international study to standardise the reporting of key outcomes in surgical trials for gastric cancer. August, alongside many other societies, patient groups and charities, were instrumental in the promotion and delivery of this project over the last few years. This study was funded by the National Institute for Health Research. The views expressed are those of the authors and not necessarily those of the NHS, the NIHR, or the Department of Health. There are two main challenges with gastric cancer. Firstly, it remains a leading cause of cancer-related death worldwide. And secondly, survival rates have not increased significantly over the last 5 decades. And this lack of progress highlights the importance of making the most out of research in this field, especially at a time where research funding is becoming more scarce. Despite significant developments in the multimodal management of this disease, surgery remains the only treatment which can potentially offer a cure. However, what we don't know for certain is what the best surgical approaches are. For example, the debate still rages on with respect to open versus minimally invasive surgery, or the extent of resection, or the degree of lymphadenectomy which should be undertaken. In an ideal world, our clinical practice should be based on the highest levels of evidence, and yet all of us are aware of the significant deficiencies within the evidence base. Let's take the example of open and minimally invasive surgery. To try and understand the question of which is best, one trial may compare both approaches in terms of survival using 3-year overall survival, recovery using post-operative pain scores, and completeness of resection with lymph node yield. Whilst another trial may decide to compare the interventions in terms of survival using 30-day mortality, recovery using length of hospital stay, and instead of completeness of resection, may report on outcomes related to surgical technique. So what do we base our choices on? We can already begin to see that to answer this question, we all need to be talking the same language. So what is the reality of outcome reporting in surgical trials for gastric cancer? Well, we previously presented the results of our published systematic review taking a deeper look at this issue. Between 1996 and 2016, a total of 32 surgical trials for gastric cancer were undertaken worldwide. The heterogeneity was stark with respect to which outcomes were reported, over 450 of them in fact, how they were defined, the time points at which they were measured, and finally the methods used to measure the outcomes. An example of this variability can be seen in how researchers reported post-operative death. Under 2/3 of studies defined post-operative death, and those that did so using one of 5 definitions. So if an outcome supposedly as straightforward as post-operative death cannot be reported in a standard manner, then what hope is there for other more complex outcomes? Understanding the type of outcomes reported in trials is not the only factor that must be considered. One of the fundamental principles of this study was the incorporation of the patient viewpoint into its findings, and therefore accessing and understanding the priorities of patients following surgery was key. We compared the priorities of patients to the outcomes reported in trials. The area in blue represents the frequency at which each outcome was reported in the surgical trials. The area in green represents the proportion of patients that identified the outcome as important to them. And as we can see, there is a significant disparity with respect to the reporting of longer-term impacts from surgery, which patients deem important, and these included outcomes such as psychological and nutritional impacts that are almost never reported in trials. So how do we address these challenges? Well, to enable researchers to speak the same language as one another and also represent the priorities of key stakeholders such as patients, we believe that the development of a core outcome set in this field was vital. A core outcome set is a group of outcomes agreed by key stakeholders that should be reported by all trials as a minimum within a given field. Importantly, a core outcome set does not intend to stop researchers reporting other outcomes that they deem to be relevant or important. In the case of this study, we opted to focus on the views of patients, surgeons and oncology nurses as key stakeholders to ensure a wide spectrum of views were captured from those with both clinical and lived experience. Only after determining what outcomes should be measured can we then decide at which time points this should be measured and what instruments can or should be used to measure them. We based our approach on a relatively well-established methodology for core outcome set development from the COMET initiative. There were two distinct stages to the project, which first involved identifying potentially important outcomes, and then secondly asking stakeholders to prioritise them. Potentially important outcomes were identified from our systematic review and trials protocols. But to ensure that we included the patient viewpoint, we also undertook a series of in-depth interviews with patients who had undergone gastrectomy to identify outcomes that may have been missed by the trials in our systematic review. And this process identified a total of 498 unique outcomes for consideration in stage 2 of the study. Of course, it wasn't pragmatic to present nearly 500 outcomes to participants to prioritise, so this list was rationalised into 56 items on which an international multi-language Delphi survey was based. Participants were asked to prioritise outcomes over 2 rounds, after which items were categorised into those which should be included or excluded from the core outcome set, and into those that needed further discussion at the consensus meeting. Given that gastric cancer is a global disease, its incidence is highest in non-English speaking countries, and the majority of trials in this field take place in the Far East, it was vital to ensure that a truly international recruitment of stakeholders took place. So to minimise the risk of missing important viewpoints during the process, the Delphi survey was made available in 8 languages. Translating the Delphi enabled us to triple our recruitment of participants to nearly 1,000 surgeons, nurses and patients from 55 countries across 6 continents, with a significant proportion of participants coming from low to middle income regions. The results from the Delphi survey were then presented to a consensus meeting held in Manchester. This was a mixed face-to-face and online consensus meeting which took place at the start of the global pandemic. A total of 43 patients, nurses and surgeons from 14 countries and 4 continents participated. Following a long and thorough day of discussions, a final core outcome set comprising 8 outcomes was agreed. Now, some of these outcomes, such as surgery-related mortality, may have been expected, but some, such as nutritional outcomes, have certainly not been reported in trials before. Also, a special point needs to be made regarding the reporting of adverse events. No consensus could be agreed on whether only serious adverse events or indeed all complications should be reported as a minimum, although we received some guidance from the meeting on how this challenge should be addressed, and work is already underway with regards to this. I want to wrap up by sharing some of my reflections on this study. Firstly, how will the findings of this study actually make a difference? Well, we now have a framework on which to base minimum standards for the reporting of outcomes in this field, which will help researchers and funders ensure that their studies are relevant to all stakeholders, including patients. The findings will also help inform national audits and registries on outcomes which should be reported, in addition to the traditional short-term outcomes often included. And finally, understanding what patients deem important will help in improving the quality of discussions between patients and healthcare professionals. However, these benefits will only be realised if the outcome set is actually used, and we understood the importance of this point when designing the project, which is why we developed a wide and inclusive collaboration across all geographical regions, ensured that the methodology used was robust and transparently reported, and employed a policy of regular updates and dissemination of the study findings. This project took nearly 5 years to complete and highlighted many of the challenges involved in the development of core outcome sets. By exploring these challenges, our study also made a number of methodological contributions to the field, including a better understanding of how Delphi surveys should be designed, how to maximise international recruitment, and understanding how outcomes are valued differently across geographical regions. Now that we know what to report, work is already underway to identify appropriate methods to measure core outcomes, with the first studies focusing on quality of life and nutritional outcomes. I've already mentioned some of our work exploring the reporting of adverse events, and finally, given the time and resource it has taken to develop this single core outcome set, we are exploring methods to streamline the process. So in summary, consensus was reached on a core outcome set for surgical trials in gastric cancer. We used a methodologically robust approach which has been transparently reported. Our focus on the patient viewpoint was a particular strength of this project, with over 270 patients contributing to its findings, as was the inclusion of a wide spectrum of views from participants in 6 continents and 55 countries. As ever, it's important to acknowledge that this was a huge team effort without which none of this would have been possible. In particular, I'd like to thank our patient partners who were involved in all stages of the study, including its preparation, recruitment, design, and execution. The project was extremely well supported by dozens of national and international professional, surgical, and nursing bodies, as well as patient groups and charities. And of course, much of the work was driven by a core team which made up our international working group. I welcome you to follow us on social media and visit our website for more information, www.gastrostudy.org. Thank you very much.